As you know, it's time for some questions. Thank you everyone for being here. It's such a pleasure to see a full room and the mountains on this beautiful days on Wednesday. um, we are here for a special seminar of the Just Social-Ecological Transformations in Latin America program seminar series. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Alejandra Echeverri Ochoa, who is visiting us from the University of California, Berkeley, to share some insights from her work on the intersection of biodiversity conservation and human cultures preservation. So I have a cheat sheet here for your bio, just to make sure that I do honor of your experience. Dr. Alejandra Echeverri is a biodiversity conservation scientist, professor, science communicator, and advocate for women, Latinx, and youth in STEM. Her research sits at the intersection of neotropical ornithology, conservation psychology, environmental policy, and community ecology. Alice Lab integrates biological fieldwork such as bird surveys with quantitative social service and surveys and qualitative content analysis to understand human relationships with nature. Specifically, she studies how people's behaviors towards the environment impact the species that live in such environments. She also studies people's attitudes and behaviors towards biodiversity and the interrelations between nature and culture to advance the science on biocultural conservation. Her work is co-produced with local communities, governments, and policymakers to co-develop and inform environmental policies. Ale is a National Geographic Young Explorer and a United Nations Youth Advocate. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, Forbes, Science, Elle Magazine Canada, Nature News, and various newspapers and media outlets across the world. She was born and raised in the Coffee region of Colombia. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. And she has a master's in resource management and environmental studies from the University of British Columbia, and a PhD from the same university in resources, environment, and sustainability. She did her postdoc with the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University, where we met a few years ago. And now she's assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. So join me in welcoming Ale to this. Thank you, Ale.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's so great to be here. I've never been to Colorado. This is a mistake for me. Very impressed with this view. I get distracted. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I titled today my talk Conserving Wildlife and Human Cultures. But first, I want to acknowledge that we are today in the ancestral and unceded lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. And I celebrate all Indigenous peoples and local communities across the world who stand strong in preserving their nature and their culture. That inspired my work and many of the work. So I want to start kind of with this big picture, which is kind of always how we start these big talks, which is it's not a secret that people are changing the environment, whether by inducing changes to climate or by creating huge patterns of deforestation, particularly the tropics. But I see the cultural laws and the biodiversity laws as intertwined, and both are consequences of these global changes. So in my side of the literature and like biodiversity conservation, they always say, oh, deforestation is the one that's causing biodiversity loss. But I argue that these two crises are actually intertwined and very important to study them together, to address them together. And yes, a lot of that is part of human behavior, that humans are the ones, cutting down trees or changing the climate. But people are also a key part of the solution, whether it's by volunteering to planting trees where trees belong or by cleaning beaches. We need to really get people on board, again, to get them excited to become part of the solution to these changes. So a lot of my work is mission-driven. I really care about maintaining the cultural diversity that we have on our planet, but also the biodiversity in the same planet. And so in one slide, my research, which I'm going to kind of summarize, is mostly uses ecology, psychology, and I mostly use quantitative methods, although by being in a department like yours, I'm being challenged, and I accept the challenge to collaborate more with qualitative researchers, and I'm learning that now, to study complex social ecological systems, to address declines in biodiversity and cultural diversity, to inform and co-develop environmental policy. And like my broad research agenda seeks to answer three main questions. So I really like to study the relationship between people and biodiversity by thinking first about this relationship, that people can have both positive and negative impacts on biodiversity. So I ask, how are environmental changes caused by people shaping the biodiversity we see on landscapes? But biodiversity similarly can have both positive and negative impacts on us. So I ask, how are these changes shaping the species that people care about, right? And then to think about the system together, how can we protect both biodiversity and culture through, for example, key economic systems? And so for today's talk, I will see how far we go in this hour, but I'd like to address first the global change and the losses of biodiversity, then get into some details on species of cultural value, then biocultural conservation, and then how I've teamed up to co-create and design environmental policies. So starting here, by answering that first question of how are environmental changes shaping the biodiversity and culture, it's important to know that not all species kind of have a bad time when people are around, right? Like we have some species that thrive in cities, for example. We have some species that thrive in agricultural crops. So my question here is kind of, what are we moving around? How are those species changes and species composition changing in human-dominated landscapes? So I work a lot with birds, especially in neotropical bird communities. And if you think about the field of the neotropical ornithology, it's been mostly a lot of my colleagues have done great work to understand which species live where. So if you think of a community assemblage of tropical birds, they're mostly structured along environmental gradients. So people say, oh, we have different species at the top of the mountain or at the bottom of the mountain. Vegetation gradient, depending on the land use, like if it's a forest or a wetland, you might get different sets and species. And precipitation, right? Like rainforests look very different than, say, a dry forest. But if you think about people, so all of this is just, natural gradients that are not considering people. But if you think about people, imagine you have a rainforest in Central America that is being cut down for agriculture. So you have land use change caused by people's actions in this landscape. But in the same place, you're having a more drier ecosystem that is becoming drier and drier because of climate change. And so when a community of birds might look like this in a rainforest, having, these kinds of birds that are strict forest dwellers, if you think together about land use change and climate change, you might end up with still the same number of species. So you might still say this is a biodiverse landscape, but very different species. You might see what we call in biology biotic homogenization, whereby the species that we're finding here are all kind of the same ones, like they all eat, for example, seaweed or scavengers, because they are the ones that can tolerate these environments. So thinking about these questions, I study how do climate and land use shape biodiversity across landscapes. And a lot of my work, especially for bird ecology, has been done in Costa Rica in the Nicoya Peninsula, so this northwestern part of the country, where in this area, there's a lot of climate variability induced by human behavior. And it's common to see local publications, newspapers saying that the drought is taking one of the main rivers, its flow. And then it's also common to see a lot of deforestation induced by human behavior when they're planting this, for example, large monocultures of sugarcane. So in this peninsula, my colleagues and I designed a study system where we have 25 private sites of farms and then reserve sites along a precipitation gradient. So this is a naturally occurring gradient of rainfall, where here you have dry forest, and towards the coast you have rainforest. So we have the precipitation changing from 1.6 meters of rainfall annually to 2.8. But then at each site, I and my colleagues, we counted birds in 6 different sites, where we also were able to independently design this study to have tree cover at local and landscape scales, where we had towns of forests surrounded by forests, agriculture surrounded by agriculture, and then this kind of forest edges where we had, maybe the point was in agriculture, but it had kind of a surrounding landscape of both forest and agriculture. So this is the landscape where I studied this, and we did mostly point counts for birds and also vegetation studies. So in total for this peninsula, over, I think it's 3 years of data, we detected 150 species in the community, where 30% of them are strict forest specialists. So birds are only we were able to find in forest. 56% of them are habitat generalists, so they can live in both forest or agriculture, and 14% of them are strict agriculture specialists that we didn't find in the edges or the forest. So we were wondering, okay, so how does, for example, precipitation and tree cover shape the diversity we see here? So this is the precipitation gradient. So here are rainier sites, these are drier sites. So yes, we found that, like what our colleagues have also shown in other places, that you have more species in rainier sites than drier sites. And when you look at that landscape coverage of the land use cover, we find that there's more species actually in the middle, where you have kind of those edges, because you get both the generalists and the forest specialists, right? And that tree cover at landscape scales, actually, you need more forest at like a higher level radius to get more species, right? But at the local level, you do kind of like the birds really like those kind of mixed plots. But it's not just about the number of species, because I showed you, like, you might have 4 forest specialists, 4 agriculture specialists. It's also about what these species are, who they are, and what they're doing in ecosystems. So there's this metric that we call functional diversity, where we measure the birds by their beaks, their wings, their lengths. We know what they eat, where they're going, to see, it's very different if you have a community of, say, 5, all 5 are doves, versus if you have a dove, a hawk, and a vulture, because they're all doing different things in the community. So here you see that if you organize by functional diversity, actually you find no effect anymore of precipitation, because even in the rainforest or the dry forest, you're having those mixes where you have carnivores and scavengers and frugivores. But then the landscape scale becomes really important. Here, you find that you only have all that high functional diversity in the forest, right? Where you have more than 75% of tree cover at the local scale and also at the landscape scale. And in fact, is the interaction of having those forests surrounded by forests, regardless if they're dry forests or rainforests, where you have the most functional diversity. So the tree cover at 75% is needed at both scales to maximize that diversity. But one thing we were interested in looking as well, but then does it matter if the forest is a park, a national park? Or can it be a farmer who, by law in Costa Rica, you have to, if you plant, say, 3 hectares of rice, you need to keep 1 in forest. So if you have, 3,000 hectares of rice, if you have huge forest patch. And here you see that actually, so here the crosses are the reserves, and these are the private farms. You see that, okay, agricultural points are very different. but all the private reserves or national parks, they're the same. So in our study, we show that private forests in working landscapes have bird communities that are indistinguishable from protected areas. So you can actually work with farmers or with landowners to keep that functional diversity around. So just to wrap up the biology side of my talk, I've shown you that species richness is affected by tree cover and precipitation. I've shown you that functional diversity is highest in the most forested sites, that agriculture and forests house different communities, but that forest land tenure policies, at least in our context, do not impact community position. But now let's think about, okay, so now we know which birds live where and how those gradients are structured in the communities. But then what is the cultural value of those birds to people? There are many birds that are important to communities. They are often carved as symbols of cultural reverence. There's people and like a whole economy around bird watching that are often going outside to find birds, and that brings economic gains to communities. So how are these changes shaping the species that people care about? So if we come back to my example of having the rainforest be cut down and then dried, now this is a species that we might lose from these rainforests in Central America, which is the resplendent quetzal. But with losing this bird, it's not just sad for the biodiversity, for the birds themselves, right? This is a species that is a god for the Mayas. So it's also in the flag and the currency of Guatemala. So you might not only just lose the species, you might also lose all the cultural value attached to that species. And people's identities, right? Tied to intertwine with those species. So in this context, I studied ecosystem services, which are the benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. But I was particularly interested in the cultural services, which are ecosystems' contributions to the non-material benefits, capabilities, and experiences that arise from human ecosystem relationships. And here, if you think about the role of birds in ecosystem services, we have birds that perform or provide services on all kinds of categories. So usually ecosystem services are organized by, say, provisioning services, or the things we can harvest directly from nature as goods or benefits. So you can, hunt birds for their meat or for their feathers or for their eggs. They also provide regulating services such as pest control. Some birds are eating bugs that become maybe pests in agricultural crops. They provide supporting services such as nutrient cycling. So, for example, these seabirds connect the marine environment and then bring those resources from the marine environment back to land. And then the cultural services, because there's some birds that are, just beautiful and people like them. And so here, what I did to understand and develop this kind of method to quantify and map cultural services. I worked actually with an anthropologist to pilot 30 interviews in the Nicoya Peninsula. And then I hired 6 local field assistants who were very important in helping me collect the data and gather all these studies. We developed a psychometric, kind of like a psychology survey, where we asked 400 people what they thought about birds, and each person saw 12 or 13 species of birds. So they would see like their icon like this, and they get a call or their song. And we asked them 14 Likert scale items, like, for example, this is a long-tailed mannequin. On a scale from 1 to 5, how much do you agree that this is a beautiful bird and that you enjoy watching it? And this way we rotated all the species in the community to see, what were people liking more and understanding why. So first, I don't know if you've taken like psychology tests where you're like, they sometimes ask you the same things, like, are you an introvert or an extrovert? So we tried to do that kind of stuff here. And we learned that Some birds are valued for their education value, so people want to study them or want to teach kids about them. Some birds are valued for bequest value. People think that birds need to be protected for future generations. So that's separate from the ones they think we should study sometimes. Some are beautiful and people enjoy watching them, so I call that bird watching value. Some have beautiful songs that people feel like they are singing and they want to wake up to those songs in the morning. So that's acoustic value. Some are important for identity, like I told you with the quetzal, some are like in the flags or currencies. And some are not good. So they think their birds are annoying, they're pests, they're too loud, they don't want to see them. So I'm calling that disservices. So here I'm going to show you pulling the data of all the people, all the birds, what people thought. And I should mention that I divided my sample by asking bird watchers who are obsessed with birds anyway, farmers who are in the land and are seeing them, but their livelihood is not like a birder who's like taking people to find them, right? And then urbanites are people who live around those towns, like in Nicoya town. And here I'm going to teach you to read my plot. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you agree that birds in general have beautiful songs? And here you can see that farmers thought that all birds have more acoustic value than bird watchers or urbanites, for example, as a whole, right? So farmers are valuing that acoustic value. So now let's see how it compares. So we see here that urbanites, people who live in cities, are the ones that are perceiving birds as causing more disservices than the other two groups, right? So they, on average, perceive birds as like not as good, you know? In terms of education, bird watchers, which makes sense because a lot of them are ornithologists who teach about this, perceive birds as having more education value than the other two groups. In terms of identity, farmers is the same as acoustic, they perceive it higher. In terms of bird watching or beautiful, like actually bird watchers and farmers value them equally. But in terms of bequest, even though these means are significantly different, you see that all points are kind of clustered. In general, almost everyone thought that all birds should be protected for future generations, even if they like them or not. And so I'm going to give you some examples of like what were these birds and what were people kind of valuing, like which ones were the ones that had those beautiful songs or which ones they thought were pretty. So in ecosystem services, there's this cascade model, which I'm sure some of you have seen probably in your classes, where you can organize an ecosystem by their properties, so like conditions, processes. So let's say in my case, you have the whole community of birds, all birds. Then you organize them by their function, so something like the shape of the beak, what they eat, and so then you can decide what they're doing. Then you tie this to a service. In case the service is like people going to bird watch, right? Like what are the birds they want to see, which then might give you a benefit, like it could be psychological. Like if I see this one, I get really excited. And then you can tie that to a value, which could be happiness, like I'm 5 times happier finding an eagle than a Canada goose. Or you can tie this to like, money, like how much would someone be willing to pay to find something really difficult to find, like a harpy or something like that. So I wanted to test that, and to do that, I just measured everything I could from those birds. Like I got their acoustic traits, I downloaded their songs, I got notes, syllables for their songs. I measured their beaks, their tails, their body mass. I saw if they had crest, their color, their plumage patterns, their diet, and some life history traits here for the biology of those birds. And I just tested with model averaging of all possible combinations of traits and models, what would be the best predictors. And here is like a quick summary of this work. It's like the birds that people love, like plumage pattern really matters. So birds that have dots, like the spotted rail, people were like, I really like this. Forest affiliation also really matters. So anything that was like a strict forest affiliate, like the cinnamons, were overall preferred. Their diet matters. So here the hummingbirds were the most beloved. But then also diet mattered because if you're a scavenger or a dog or a carnivore, people don't like it, especially the farmers and the urbanites. So the diet actually was the one that made most of the evidence like this. And if I get you some quotes to kind of introduce you to some of the stories in this, the characters of this story. This is the long-tailed manatee that you saw earlier. The locals call it Toledo because that's kind of how it sounds. And people say, and Toledo is not one of my favorite. I love how it dances and its colors. And then there's the great-tailed grackle. And people would say things like, we must take care of all the birds because they are part of the nature that God left us. Everyone has a place in the ecology, in the system of each region. They must be there to do good. All the birds except the grackle. I don't like that one at all. So this was like the main disservice provider. And then it was so loaded that we had to write a paper just about the grackle that had so much more data for this bird. People would say things like, this grackle, they say it comes from Nicaragua. In fact, we have a bird here that was similar, but this one came to invade all the other birds. This is not true. This bird is actually native from the mangroves of Colombia, Panama, Costa Rica. The Costa Ricans think this bird is Nicaraguan. They say this grackle is a pest. It damages the nests of other birds. We've seen it eating even its own sons. They cause damage to the rice. They take out the rice. We didn't have grackles around, and now there are many. And they went as far as criminalizing it. They would say grackles are so destructive. They get here and eat the eggs of other birds. If they were like a person, they would be someone who's bad. They would be the narcos. Okay, really heavy stories. And for the Colombians in the audience, you might find it surprising because the same grackle is beloved across Colombia. It's actually the muse of painter Enrique Grau from the city where Shakira is from. So you have all of these grackles all over it. It's a symbol of Afro-Caribbean identity. We have grackle statues, in many cities. So even the same bird can be socially constructed in completely different ways. So now, how are climate change and land use change impacting these culturally important birds? So remember that this was precipitation gradient. So down the coast here of the Nicoya Peninsula, you have wetter sites. And here you have, I'll show you just the land use of like forest or agriculture. And this other, which is mostly mangrove habitat. So I mapped all those birds that people scored as like, I like this one for this reason or this one for this value. And if you see, both for farmers and urbanites and for bird watchers, there's more species that people find charismatic in the rainforest for both groups. And in the dry agricultural areas up here, way less species that people want to see. A lot of those are dominated by browns. So rainforests have more culturally important species. And these are some of the species that we will lose if we keep altering the rainforest. Let me see if this song will. I can't play the song, but then I'll have it. I'll share with you the song later of the kinds of songs that people listen in these forests. So here, to answer this question, I've showed you that people perceive 5 positive cultural services of birds and 1 negative. That different groups of people value birds for different reasons. The cultural services are very context dependent, and that rainforests have more culturally important species than any other ecosystem. So now moving on to kind of the last part of the talk that is about content of science. Now I was also thinking, well, then if we have culture and we have biodiversity, how can we protect both through key economic sectors? So there are places like Machu Picchu where you have both, right? You have cultural diversity, you have biodiversity, and there's tourism that is in the interest of tourism, they want to protect that, right? So that when tourists go, there's like a nice place to visit. What about maybe fisheries? Some locals really like to fish some of these species, but if you keep it kind of sustainable scale, like could you maybe develop like a sustainable local tourism business that, you know, in this case, this guy would like himself go get you lobster from your ceviche, you know, that kind of situation. And so in this case, I thought about, well, but what are the economic sectors that we're having to govern biodiversity? And for this study, I focused in Colombia because Colombia is one of the main biodiverse countries in the world with so many species described. We're like #1 of birds, #2 in frogs, and you know every week it keeps changing. But we have a lot of species described. But also, if you think about the cultural diversity here, it's interesting because here you see in green, this is a map of continental Colombia, as you see the protected areas. In blue, the indigenous people's reserves, and then in brown, the Afro-Colombian lands. And as a country, we have over 170 ethnic groups and more than 65 languages spoken. But we have all these jurisdictions that are kind of interacting to govern biodiversity. So I analyzed all the policies, laws, documents that the government had issued to try to understand which sectors are being governed by biodiversity. And one thing to notice here is that this is like a histogram, so more means more policies on that. The protected areas, climate change, and poverty are the main policy domains that are governing Colombia's biodiversity. But in 60 years, I found that there are about 200 policies representing different policy targets and domains. But I wanted to look at this one with tourism because the government has pushed for tourism to be the next thing. Like they want to focus on Colombia becoming a biocultural destination, one where that sector supposedly should be the one that is preserving biodiversity and cultural diversity. So for the tourism sector, tourism contributes 10% of global GDP, with nature-based tourism being its fastest growing sector. And the world's most visited places are those of cultural heritage and also natural heritage. So for example, we have the Great Barrier Reef, where people go mostly for the biodiversity, but you also have, Egypt, where people go mostly for the cultural heritage. But could there be places like Machu Picchu or like Rio de Janeiro with the carnival where you have both, right? Where you could actually tap into those sectors together. And for this work, and this is kind of very recent work that I've been developing, I've been putting together a team of all sorts of experts, like we have musicians, we have anthropologists, we have biologists who study birds and fish and plants. And we've been trying to understand, are biodiversity and cultural diversity correlated? If so, where? And what we were doing is that we are trying to measure, map, quantify cultural diversity in parallel as we do with biodiversity. So we, for example, developed metrics to map music festivals, the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, intangible heritage sites, museums, indigenous territories, and then the biodiversity, which we already had those layers for, but we hadn't really thought of it doing them together. And if you're interested in this, because this work was with an ethnomusicologist, he put together a music playlist for you to listen to if you want to see what the music genres looks like. We were trying to make kind of like species distribution models, but for like endemic music to try to map that cultural diversity. And one thing that was, interesting for us developing this project is that as biologists, we're told when we take our kind of training on biogeography, that Colombia has 5 biotic regions. It either the Amazon is different from the Andes, from the Caribbean, from the Orinoquia or the Pacific. And we're told that those regions structure the species you see. But if you go to those regions, you see that people in every region are having music festivals that are tied to that biodiversity. So this is, for example, the Sampacho Festival of the Pacific, and this person is dressed like those dart frogs, like those poisonous frogs for the festival. This is the Carnaval de Barranquilla of last year. They're having carnival actually right now this week. And this is the queen of the carnival with the community dressed like the birds of that region. This is in the Amazon. This is in the Andes or in Pasto. And this is in the Orinoquia here. So people are always painting what they see, singing. So in every region, we see that these music festivals and the art are allude to the local biodiversity. And so this is work that is very much recent. It's like I've been like working on this like the past couple of weeks. But one thing we wanted to see is like, well, what about those jurisdictions? Oops, sorry about that. Do we have more species in indigenous lands or protected areas or Afro-Colombian lands? So if you see just by species richness, these are indigenous lands, these are Afro-Colombian lands, and the rest in purple are protected areas. We see that actually, just by species richness, we have more species in Afro-Colombian territories and indigenous reserves than in protected areas. But if you look at just endemic species, so species unique to Colombia, we have more of those in protected areas, mostly because those occur along the Andes, where the government is in the Andes. Most ornithologists are Andean anyway, so it's like we know that there's more endemic species in protected areas. But the Afro-Colombian territories, the Afro-Colombian lands have more threatened species than the other 2 jurisdictions. And to get back to that point of like, well, but then are cultural diversity and biodiversity correlated? Here in purple, you see areas where both of them are high. Red are areas where just biodiversity is high, and blue are areas where just cultural diversity is high. So we see that in areas like the Pacific, they are biocultural regions. And now we can, we already knew that qualitatively, but now we can also show that empirically and quantitatively that areas like here you have Afro-Colombian communities, a much richer landscape of music, like the marimbas del Pacifico and species that are unique to those places. That's also true for the Orinoquia region, where also is one of the places on the planet with the most freshwater fish species. So it's a place where there's indigenous peoples, tapirs, and very important for fisheries, for example. But I want to zoom in, and with this, I think it's the end of my talk. I want to zoom into one municipality, this one, Valledupar. If you zoom in entirely to that municipality, this is what it would look like. This is a municipality that has the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is known as one of the most irreplaceable irreplaceable places on Earth in terms of species diversity. You have rivers, you have mountains, you have dry forests, Sierra Nevada. You also have a site designated by UNESCO as the place where there's the ancestral knowledge systems of the Arhuaco, Kogi, Wiwa, and Cancomo indigenous peoples, which we try to illustrate here. And you also have music festivals like the Festival de la Leyenda Vallenata, is like a international recognized music festival. Territory of Afro-Colombian communities represented here, and tons of museums. And my point with this work was to bring up that if we keep doing work separately, like if anthropologists and ethnographers just go and document the work of the, let's say, this ancestral knowledge system, and then biologists go and count all these birds, but we don't do it together. We're missing half the story. And even with the music, I can share with you one of the songs. We have the songs of the vallenatos singing to those birds, right? So these things are very intertwined, and it's why I like doing this very interdisciplinary work with my colleagues who are experts in art. And so just to wrap up this part, biodiversity is governed through many sectors, including tourism, agriculture, forestry. The many cultural practices are intertwined with biodiversity, such as the music. The more research is needed to keep connecting ecological and cultural variables in the context of biodiversity, biocultural diversity conservation. That cultural diversity and biodiversity are correlated, but not everywhere. And I didn't mention this part because I didn't talk too much about tourism, but I just want to bring up that if we are to mainstream tourism as a sector, we need to involve those indigenous peoples and local communities to see even if that's what they want to do, if they want to share their culture. But also, it seems that biocultural tourism could be a potentially valuable way to conserve both wildlife and human cultures. And then all the work I do, there's the academic side of it, trying to publish it. But really, if we don't get to work with policymakers or with local communities to have any changes on the ground, like we're really not doing much. So for example, for the work in Costa Rica, I've been giving a lot of talks with the local communities to share the findings, and they developed games like Aves y Cultura, where they teach the kids about the birds and the stories of those birds. They also created biological corridors where we were doing trainings with the communities on bird watching monitoring using eBird to get them to keep monitoring the work after I handed it over all my data. It's like for them to keep themselves monitoring that. At the national policy, I've been trying to work with the Ministry of Tourism and Culture and Environment to get them to work together to inform the development plan that they're currently focusing very heavily on bird watching tourism and protecting species, but also by recognizing that a lot of these species are on the jurisdiction of communities. So it's not just for the government to do conservation in protected areas. At the international level, like I really love international policy, and this is something that for the young people in the room, I really got started in all of these and think about these questions of culture, biodiversity, because of, Model UN type of things that I did when I was in high school. And there is actually a very active youth group of the United Nations Convention of Biological Diversity that on purpose rotates youth to go around and do that. So if you're interested in that, like make sure to talk to me about it. But it's kind of like, how do we advocate for all these groups to then get resources from multilateral development banks to then bring back and do conservation in their territories. And just to end, I think I've told you today that people are shaping biodiversity and the cultural patterns. The people like some species, but dislike others. The functional traits can indeed predict some of these cultural ecosystem services. That biodiversity, biocultural diversity can be mainstream in ecotourism, but it really depends on the communities, what aspects of culture, if any, they're willing to share and modify. And that it's up to all of us, including academic students, to work with policymakers, decision makers, indigenous peoples, and local communities to see the positive changes we want to see in how we steward our planet. And with that, I end by saying that I just opened my lab at UC Berkeley not too long ago, and that if you're interested in grad school or volunteering, or it's like up for discussion, it's information, but take a look. And then with that, I end, so we have some time for questions. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Ali. That was awesome. You have a few minutes for questions.
I think it's the best way to get people to care about the best areas.
That's a good question. If the species has some sort of story that matters, people will care about it. So, for example, there's some communities where I worked where they had this like bats as their symbol, and I was like, "Oh, how did that happen?" And turns out that in their stories of the community, the bats were the ones that like were pollinating some of the flowers so that spring could happen. And so I think creating any positive stories about either the role of that species in the ecosystem or valuing them for any specific thing they might have, either personality or life history, that is usually one way of getting people to care. And I think one thing we've learned with conservation marketing is that species that were once disliked, you can turn it around and like look at the grackle. It's the same species, and you can have people put statues about it. If an artist suddenly like, this is my new view, or maybe hate it, right? So, yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It seems like you put a tremendous amount of work into what you showed us in Costa Rica and in Colombia. And I was just wondering, what are your next steps for the future? What are you going to be turning towards next?
I guess it will depend on which students end up joining my lab. But I'm hoping, like, I have one postdoc right now who's working with me on developing kind of more theory around this kind of biocultural conservation and which species become revered in cultures. So for that work, we might be working in Northern California. Now that I'm based at my postdocs from there, I'm hoping to recruit Colombian students and postdocs so we can continue this work. But you know, it depends on where I get funding to work and where are my students from, so that they work with the communities, right?
So when you have a species that is like revered by a culture, do you see like a correlation between policies being enacted to protect that species and maybe even like population numbers? Like with the grackle, is there a higher amount of grackles in cultures that really like them versus ones that hate them?
That's a good question, and I will answer that yes. I think like if we have some species that are more important for culture, you might end up seeing countries, communities acting faster. So here is like bison, for example, super important species, and now there's like all these plans to restore bison populations, right? We see that also for beaver, that is really important to some communities. With the grackle is a different situation because they're not endangered. They're actually expanding their range. So actually with them, it might be the opposite. Like for them, you might need, if people think that that's what they want to do, management plans, which then might imply culls. And then if it's revered, they won't support a cull for a species they left, right? So it depends on the species and what the wildlife managers and the communities want for that species. Yes.
No, thank you for the presentation. A lot of insights for our work.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Thanks very much.
Really, something that interests me is the results from the farmers in Costa Rica. They seems to be quite good answers from them and the relation. And are they small farmers? I can see some of by empirically with our work in Brazil, southern Brazil farmers. But there is a huge difference when you are talking with small farmers or larger farmers. What about that in that specific data or information?
Yeah, so in that case, there's a mix. We have some smallholders. They're mostly growing like subsistence, like food crops like mangoes, some subsistence rice. Then we also worked with the highest, probably biggest farm I've ever seen of like an ingenio's sugar cane. It's huge. That farm is like, you go, there's a gate, there's a school so that the farm workers put their kids in school there. And it's like a whole village. And then also work with the largest rice farm, like the owner doesn't even live there. It's like helicopters to his farm. And they also cared back also for a different reason. And they were the one that had those huge reserves that are almost like a national park because they are more regulated. Like the government makes sure that their farm is audited. They comply with every single standard, pesticide or this and that. But then they have this law of compensation that for every 3 hectares they grow, 1 has to stay in forest. But because it was one landowner who owns everything, that landowner makes that reserve, right? It's not like 4 fragmented forests here and there, as we see with the smallholders. It's like they have very divided. Like I think in this slide where I show the this slide, like this is one of the sugarcane farms where it's like the entire thing, the reserve of the farm, and then everything I think is sugarcane. So they all cared about conservation. Costa Rica is very for conservation. Yeah, I don't know if this would be true, like some farms in Brazil. Or in questions? Yes.
I have a question. Yeah, it was really, thank you. First, and it was really interesting to see the overlapping of the like cultural richness and like biodiversity richness in Colombia. So I was wondering like what, of course, like the Andean region doesn't have like so much biocultural diversity, but I know that like species shape the identities of many people there, especially farmers. So I was wondering how those like conservation strategies should be directed, should be shaped based on that lack of bicultural richness that maybe cannot be perceived as bicultural richness in like Afro-Colombian regions or indigenous regions, but definitely there is like a close relation of people and nature.
No, this is a good point, and it's when we were writing this, like if you read the manuscript, it has like such long section of caveats because we're like none of the authors, we are not ourselves Afro-Colombian. We're all Andean, and why do you mean we don't have culture? Like, but it's because the cultural metrics of like the UNESCO that have been designed for indigenous and Afro-Colombian ethnic minorities and all the mestizo communities, campesino communities is like not recognized by say UNESCO as like an ethnic group, right? So that would be the next phase. Is like, well, what happens in places where it might not be just richness in numbers, right? Like my biodiversity study, but like maybe places like Alaska, where it's like you don't have actually that much biodiversity in terms of numbers, but the interaction is even closer. So like the Andes, Bolivia would be the same. And yeah, I think it's like a limitation of our epistemology. But then you see, yeah, that work, if you do it qualitatively, you of course say the Andes has a lot of culture that is not indigenous culture in Colombia, but campesino culture. The Paisa region of the Arriero culture is not represented. Like there's all these cultures that have been more mixed. Also the Spanish that is not represented here because we were trying to follow the protocols of the UNESCO. So that's a huge limitation and a huge opportunity to do more qualitative work there to overcome those barriers.
Yes. Echoing what other folks have said, thank you so much. Super fascinating, really interesting work. It's awesome. One of the things we try to do in this space broadly is also thinking about like transdisciplinary research, which yours very much speaks to. So just be curious to hear some of your thoughts on like working with how you actually do the work, like working with communities. You mentioned like working with, research assistants, and you also talked about at the end about like making sure like your work translates into policy or practice or meaningful kind of like outcomes for communities. But just would love to hear you think a little bit more about how you actually navigate that in so many different contexts and some of the challenges and some of the things that you've learned through that process.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So for Costa Rica, for example, I spent like 5 years going there, right? Like I spent like 5 field seasons every summer. I first did the ecological work. So where you only talk to these first 20 farmers and then like work with them. And once you have that trust, then you can do the social work. And then even then I realized that locals won't tell me what they think about birds because they're already taken out for conservation. Thinking, hey, that bird, if you want to shoot it, you're not gonna tell me that, right? So then in community working with I would go to like these farms and like, for example, some of these farms I said like they have like schools, so they go to the schools and then try to find like, does anyone want to be my assistant for this summer and then get them to be the ones to do the surveys because then they are the ones talking to their family members. And so a lot of time spent, you know, doing that work and prep work and the work. Of course, now as a professor, I don't have as much time to go and be in the field by myself for so long. But now what I do for these other projects, like for this one, is then I work with people who work with those communities, right? So now it's like for this one, we had like anthropologists who work with many other communities and the fish biologists who works with the fisher communities. And then we each one making sure that like we're representing them and like whoever wanted to be author with them. It takes a lot of co-development. And now it's interesting because like now I also just wait to see if communities approach me. So after the work in Costa Rica, for example, the indigenous community, the Berkeley, were like, why didn't you work with us? We have our entire mythologies based on birds. And now they're like, can you work with it? Can you send a student? We want you to write a story about our community. And then that way, it's like, okay, they are approaching me for a very specific question. And then how can we make the next generation of PhD students, master's students, like serve that community? Because they're like, why aren't we getting money for cultural conservation if we have the same as the Amazon? Can you show that? It's like, how can we work with that? So a lot of listening, a lot of time spent in the field. Like we just hanging out with people. Dancing in this carnivals.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I think we're getting close to shy.
Yeah, so thank you again, Ale. That was very inspiring, very cool, and very well articulated. So thank you. Thank you.
If you haven't already eaten cookies, there's cookies. And if you have already eaten cookies, there's cookies. Please.
Make it very cookies.
Yeah.
Everybody.